In 1712, a committee of the Royal Society of London published its verdict. The report was called the Commercium Epistolicum. It ran to hundreds of pages. It examined letters, manuscripts, dates, and testimonies. It concluded, formally and officially, that Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, philosopher, diplomat, mathematician, had stolen the calculus, stolen it from Isaac Newton. The verdict was treated as the final word of the most prestigious scientific body in the Western world. What the world did not know, what would not be confirmed for another century, was that the man who wrote the committee's report and controlled its findings and shaped its conclusions from the very first page was Isaac Newton himself. He sat on the committee. He appointed the committee. He was, in every meaningful sense, the committee. And then he published it as the independent judgment of history. This is a story about calculus. It is also a story about what genius does when it is afraid. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day 1642 in a small stone farmhouse in Woolsthorpe, Lincolnshire. His father had died 3 months before. He was premature, small enough, they said, to fit inside a quart pot. No one expected him to survive the week. He would outlive almost everyone who ever challenged him. His childhood was not warm. When he was 3, his mother remarried and left him with his grandmother. He did not forgive her for this. He recorded in a childhood list of sins that he had threatened to burn her house down with her and his stepfather inside. He was 8 years old. He grew into a man who trusted no one completely, who kept his discoveries to himself for years, sometimes decades before publishing, who collected enemies the way other men collected debts, with quiet, methodical patience, who described himself in one of his rare moments of poetry as a boy playing on the seashore, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. A beautiful image, also perhaps a revealing one. He was always alone on that shore. He preferred it that way. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was born in Leipzig, Germany in 1646, 4 years after Newton, the son of a professor of moral philosophy. His father died when he was 6, but unlike Newton, Leibniz was not abandoned. He was given free access to his father's library. By the age of 12, he had taught himself Latin and begun reading the classical scholars. By 15, he had entered the university. Where Newton turned inward, Leibniz turned outward. He wanted the world, all of it. He moved through courts and capitals, wrote letters to everyone, theologians, scientists, politicians, kings. He believed, with a kind of radiant sincerity, that human knowledge was one great unified thing, and that if enough brilliant people could only talk to each other, they would eventually solve everything. He was charming. He was prolific. He made friends the way Newton made enemies, and he was, by every measure, one of the most formidable minds of his century, perhaps of any century. Two men, same era, different worlds. Newton, isolated, secretive, methodical. A man who kept his greatest discovery locked in a drawer for years because he wasn't ready to be questioned. Leibniz, social, ambitious, restless. A man who wanted credit and connection in equal measure and never quite understood that wanting both at once made you vulnerable. The collision was coming. It had been coming since the 1660s. Neither of them would survive it intact. To understand what this rivalry meant, you have to understand what was happening to the world around it. The 17th century was not a calm time. It was the century in which Europe's understanding of reality itself was being dismantled and rebuilt. Copernicus had already moved the Earth. Galileo had already been tried for agreeing with him. Kepler had mapped the orbits of the planets. Descartes had suggested that the universe operated by mechanical laws, that God, if he existed, was more like a clockmaker than a king. And then came the question that no one could yet answer. What are the laws? The actual laws? The mathematics beneath everything? How does a planet stay in orbit? How does a thrown stone follow its arc? How do you calculate the area under a curve that changes at every point? How do you describe motion itself? Not a snapshot, but motion, change, the living, continuous movement of the physical world. This was the problem of the age. Every major mathematician in Europe knew it. Several had come close. What was missing was a language, a mathematical language capable of describing change, continuity, rates, the calculus of the infinitely small. The stakes were not merely academic. The nation that produced this discovery would have a claim on intellectual supremacy. Its scientists would be positioned to describe, and eventually control, the mechanics of the physical world. Artillery trajectories, planetary predictions, the engineering of ships and bridges and machines. Mathematics was power, always had been. But in the late 1600s, it was becoming something more. It was becoming the grammar of nature itself. England and the continental European powers, particularly France and the German states, were already in deep cultural and political competition. The scientific academies of London and Paris had been founded within years of each other, each explicitly intended to demonstrate national intellectual dominance. Into this arena stepped Newton and Leibniz, not as representatives of nations, not consciously, not at first. They were simply two men who both found the answer, but around them the nations noticed. And the nations had their own uses for the rivalry. There is one more thing the world they lived in demands we understand. Publication in the 17th century was not what it is today. There were no preprint servers, no timestamps, no digital trails. A man could work on a discovery for a decade, show his notebooks to no one, and publish only when he was certain no one could challenge him. And another man, working in a different country, on different paper, with a different notation, could arrive at the same destination independently years later and have no way to prove he had not seen the first man's work. This ambiguity was not merely inconvenient, it was the powder keg. In the summer of 1665, Cambridge University closed its doors. The Great Plague had reached London and was spreading north. Students and faculty fled. Isaac Newton, 22 years old, a recent graduate of undistinguished record, returned to his mother's farm in Woolsthorpe. He stayed for 18 months. What happened in those 18 months is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of human thought. Working alone, with almost no resources, separated from every library and colleague and intellectual stimulus that a university could provide, Newton invented the calculus. He called it the method of fluxions. Fluxions, flowing quantities. The mathematical description of how things change. He developed it to solve specific problems, the way curves behave, the way velocities relate to positions, the way areas accumulate. He was not trying to build a monument, he was solving problems. The monument was a side effect. He also, in those same months, began the work that would eventually become the theory of universal gravitation, and made his first major discoveries in optics. 18 months, a farm, a young man alone with his mind. He put almost none of it in a publishable form. This is the part the legend always glosses over. Newton discovered the calculus in the mid-1660s. He published nothing formal about it until 1687, in the Principia Mathematica, and even then only obliquely, embedded in geometric proofs. He would not publish a direct account of his method of fluxions until 1704. The core document, De Methodis Serierum et Fluxionum, written in 1671, sat in a drawer for decades. Why? The explanations Newton gave were various. He was not satisfied. He was not finished. He did not want to be drawn into controversy. He had been burned before. His early paper on light and optics had provoked immediate criticism, and he had responded to that criticism with cold fury and a near-complete withdrawal from public scientific discourse. He did not like being questioned. He did not like being doubted. And so he kept his greatest work secret. He showed it to friends, wrote about it in letters, circulated manuscripts in limited academic circles. He built a reputation among those who knew, while keeping the broader world in the dark. This decision, to discover without publishing, is the crack in the foundation of everything that follows. In 1672, Leibniz arrived in Paris. He was 25 years old, working as a diplomatic envoy for the Elector of Mainz, with a scheme to convince the French government to redirect its military ambitions toward Egypt rather than the German states. The scheme failed. But Paris succeeded, in every other sense, beyond his wildest expectations. He met Christian Huygens, the greatest mathematician in Europe at that moment, and Huygens agreed to tutor him. Leibniz had a solid mathematical education, But Huygens revealed to him the frontier of what was not yet known. The problems no one had solved, the gaps waiting for someone with the right kind of mind. Leibniz had exactly that kind of mind. Over the next several years, working in Paris, then visiting London twice, then settling in Hanover as court librarian and advisor to the Duke of Brunswick, Leibniz independently developed his own version of the calculus. He called his differential calculus. Not fluxions, differentials. Not dots above letters, dx and dy. The notation that is still standard today, still written on classroom boards around the world, still the notation of every physics textbook and engineering manual you will ever hold in your hands. His approach was different from Newton's in emphasis and notation, though the underlying mathematics was equivalent. Where Newton thought in terms of flowing quantities, rates of change over time, Leibniz thought in terms of infinitely small differences. Different philosophical frameworks, same fundamental insight. He published in 1684 a paper in the journal Acta Eruditorum, a mere 6 pages, titled in Latin, Nova Methodus pro maximis et minimis, a new method for maxima and minima. 6 pages that changed the direction of mathematics. By 1684, Newton had known about the calculus for nearly 20 years. He had not published it. Leibniz had been working on his version for roughly a decade. He published it. That asymmetry, those 20 years of Newton's silence, is the fault line this entire story runs along. The two men were not strangers when the war began. In 1673, on one of his visits to London, Leibniz met several members of the Royal Society. He demonstrated an early version of a calculating machine he had built, a device that could multiply and divide, not merely add. He was admitted as a fellow of the society. He was charming. He was welcomed. He also had contact, indirect and partial, with Newton's unpublished work. This is the fact that will haunt everything. In 1676, Newton, at the urging of the Royal Society's secretary Henry Oldenburg, agreed to correspond with Leibniz. He sent 2 letters, now known as the Epistola Prior and the Epistola Posterior. In these letters, Newton disclosed, cautiously, partially, in some places deliberately obscured through anagram, the outlines of his method of fluxions. Newton later claimed these letters were proof that Leibniz had seen his work before developing his own version. That the publication in 1684 was not independent discovery, it was dressed-up theft. Leibniz maintained, for the rest of his life, that these letters showed him nothing he had not already discovered, that the anagrams were unreadable, that his own method, his own notation, his own philosophical framework had developed independently. Both claims cannot be entirely false. Both claims cannot be entirely true, and no one alive today, with all the manuscripts and letters and notebooks that historians have now examined, has been able to say with absolute certainty where the line was. The truth may be this: both men invented the calculus, independently, in the same century. Which is not impossible. It is, in fact, exactly what the history of science is full of. Simultaneous discovery is common when a field is ripe. Oxygen, evolution, the telephone, multiple independent discoverers are the rule, not the exception. But Newton could not accept this. Not about calculus. Not about the one great achievement of his impossible, solitary, plague-year mind. And that inability, that refusal, is where the war begins. For a long time, it was not a war. It was something more like weather, a gathering of pressure that neither man fully acknowledged. Through the 1680s and into the 1690s, Newton's Principia Mathematica appeared and changed the world. Published in 1687, it was the most complete mathematical description of the physical universe yet produced. Gravity, motion, orbits, all of it rendered in rigorous mathematics. It made Newton, overnight, the most celebrated scientist in Europe. The Principia did not use the calculus in its final published form. Newton presented everything in classical geometric proofs, partly for strategic reasons, partly because he distrusted his readers' ability to follow the newer methods. But the mathematics underneath, the mathematics that allowed him to derive the results, was the method of fluxions. Continental mathematicians, working from Leibniz's 1684 paper, began developing calculus rapidly and without Newton's work. The Bernoulli brothers in Basel, L'Hôpital in Paris, Leibniz himself expanding the framework. A whole school of mathematics flourished on the continent using Leibniz's notation, building on Leibniz's publications. In England, almost no one could follow suit. Newton had not taught his methods, had not published them. His followers worked in his shadow but could not extend his framework because they did not have the tools in open form. The contrast was not lost on English mathematicians, and it was not lost on Newton. The first public suggestion that something was amiss appeared in 1699. A Swiss mathematician named Nicolas Fatio de Dulier, who had been, for several years, extraordinarily close to Newton in ways that Newton's later biographers still debate, published a paper claiming that Newton was the first inventor of the calculus and implying that Leibniz had derived his method from Newton's earlier work. Fatio was Newton's friend, almost certainly writing with Newton's blessing, though this was never acknowledged. Leibniz responded in print. He called Fatio's claim false and unfair. He defended his own independent discovery. The first shots had been fired. Newton, publicly, said nothing. The first decade of the 1700s brought the conflict to a new temperature. In 1703, Newton was elected president of the Royal Society. He would hold this position for the remaining 24 years of his life. The Society was England's most powerful scientific institution. Under Newton's presidency, it became, in several important ways, a projection of Newton's personal authority. He was not a democratic president. He was not even a collegial one. He ran the society with the expectation of loyalty. He did not separate his personal disputes from the institution's official voice. The line between Isaac Newton and the Royal Society of London under his leadership became very thin. Meanwhile, Leibniz had published, in 1710, a paper in the Acta Eruditorum that contained what Newton's allies read as an implicit accusation, a suggestion that Newton's use of fluxions in the Principia may have been developed with knowledge of Leibniz's published work rather than prior to it. Whether Leibniz intended this as a direct accusation or a scholarly observation is not entirely clear from the text. His supporters said the latter. Newton read it as the former. And Newton's response to the suspicion of an insult was always the same: total, methodical war. In 1711, John Keill, one of Newton's disciples, published an explicit accusation in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Leibniz had stolen the calculus from Newton. His notation was different, but the mathematics was derived from Newton's earlier unpublished work. Leibniz wrote to the Royal Society, demanding a formal hearing. He wanted the matter investigated properly. This was his critical mistake. He was asking the judge to investigate himself. In 1712, the Royal Society formed a committee to investigate the priority dispute. The committee had 11 members. All of them were British. Several were personal friends and allies of Newton. None of them were neutral parties by any scholarly standard. Leibniz was not consulted. Leibniz was not asked to present his case. Leibniz was not even informed of the committee's deliberations as they happened. The committee produced the Commercium Epistolicum, a collection of letters and documents, arranged and annotated to support the conclusion that Newton had invented the calculus first, and that Leibniz had been in a position to see the essential ideas before producing his own version. It was presented as the impartial verdict of an august institution. Newton had written significant portions of it himself. He had directed the selection of documents. He had overseen the framing. He wrote, anonymously, the official summary that accompanied the report. And then, in subsequent years, he wrote anonymous reviews of the report, praising its impartiality and thoroughness in the very journal published by the society he controlled. He reviewed his own verdict, anonymously, favorably. Let that sit for a moment. This is Isaac Newton, the man who articulated the mathematical laws that govern the motion of every planet in the solar system, spending years of his late life secretly writing anonymous pamphlets to win a priority dispute. Going to these lengths, these extraordinary, obsessive, almost incomprehensible lengths. What does that tell us? We'll come back to that. Leibniz was shocked by the Commercium Epistolicum. Not entirely surprised, he knew Newton's allies were hostile, and he had felt the temperature rising for years. But the scale of it, the institutional weight, the apparent unanimity of English scholarly opinion against him. He fought back as best he could. He wrote letters. He circulated a counter-pamphlet, published anonymously, ironically, called the Charta Volans, which accused Keele and, implicitly, Newton of falsehood. He appealed to the Princess of Wales, who admired him and had influence at the English court. He corresponded with Samuel Clarke, a prominent English philosopher and Newton ally, in a long exchange of letters about the nature of space, time, and God, a philosophical debate that ran in parallel with the mathematical war, and in which Leibniz was, by most readings, the more subtle thinker. He was fighting on every front, and he was fighting alone. He had no institution behind him. He had no national scientific body whose president he was. He had the Duke of Brunswick's household and a vast network of correspondents, philosophers, diplomats, mathematicians across Europe, but no centralized power structure, no body that could pronounce a verdict with Newton's kind of institutional authority. He had intelligence, he had eloquence, he had probably the stronger philosophical case. It was not enough. And then, in 1714, the world shifted in the worst possible way for Leibniz. The Elector of Hanover became King George I of England. Leibniz had served the House of Hanover for decades. He had expected to move to London with the new court, to finally have a position in England, to argue his case in person, to be restored to some standing in the intellectual world that had turned against him. George I had other ideas. He did not bring Leibniz to London. He left him in Hanover, ostensibly to finish a history of the Brunswick family that Leibniz had been working on for years. The history was unfinished, and the king wanted it finished. Newton, meanwhile, was the intellectual ornament of the English crown, the Lucasian professor, the president of the Royal Society, the man whose portrait would eventually appear on the English currency. Leibniz was left in Hanover. He was 68 years old. His health was failing. His correspondence had thinned. The men who had admired him were dying or had moved on. He died on November 14, 1716. No one from the Hanoverian court attended his funeral. His secretary was the only person present. Newton outlived him by 11 years. Now we need to say what the standard narrative almost never says. The standard narrative runs like this. Newton and Leibniz both invented the calculus. The priority dispute was ugly and nationalistic. We should give credit to both men and move on. Both notations have value. Both approaches are valid. Science was the ultimate winner. Let's talk about the mathematics. This is not wrong, but it is careful in a way that avoids the uncomfortable center of the story. So let's go there. Isaac Newton was, by almost any evidence we have, terrified of one specific thing: being found out as a fraud. Not rationally, he was not a fraud and he knew this, but emotionally, in the deep irrational place where even geniuses are human, he believed at some level that there was a version of reality in which he had not been first, in which the priority was genuinely unclear, in which another man had legitimately arrived at the same place, and this he could not tolerate. Because Newton's self-conception was built entirely on the idea of singular, solitary, first-man genius, he had no social life to speak of, no family, no warm relationships of consequence, no emotional inheritance to fall back on. He had his work, his precedence, his place in the hierarchy of minds. If Leibniz was a co-inventor, Newton was no longer the man who stood alone on the shore of the great ocean of truth. He was just one of two men who found the same island. This is not a psychological speculation. This is legible in the behavior. Newton was wealthy in his later years. He was master of the mint, a lucrative government position. He was knighted. He was celebrated. He had everything a man of his era could want. He did not need the calculus credit for material reasons, but he spent decades, literally decades of his life pursuing this dispute, writing anonymous pamphlets, stacking committees, managing correspondence, watching the controversy the way a man watches a wound that he keeps reopening. That is not the behavior of a man who knows he has already won. That is the behavior of a man who can never quite believe it. Leibniz, for his part, made a catastrophic error of judgment that had nothing to do with mathematics. He believed the dispute was still about ideas. He believed that if he could make the argument clearly enough, if he could demonstrate, through letters and pamphlets and philosophical reasoning, that his invention was independent and genuine, that reason would eventually win. But Newton had moved the dispute out of the realm of reason before Leibniz fully understood what was happening. The Commercium Epistolicum was not a scholarly document. It was a legal verdict delivered by a court that had already decided its conclusion. It was political. It was institutional. Leibniz brought a philosopher's tools to a politician's game, and there's something almost painful about watching him argue with Clarke in those final years about the nature of space and time. Elegant, subtle philosophical arguments, while Newton, who had stopped engaging personally years ago, let his proxies do the work of destroying Leibniz's reputation, one pamphlet at a time. Leibniz wanted a debate. Newton wanted a record. They were not even fighting the same war. There is another dimension to Leibniz's vulnerability that deserves to be named. He was German. He worked in German courts, wrote in Latin and French and German, moved through the diplomatic world of continental Europe. His primary languages of scholarly communication were not English. The Royal Society published in English, controlled its own journal, spoke to an English audience. When it issued its verdict, it issued it in the language of the victors, in the institution of the victors, to an audience already inclined toward the victors. Leibniz had no equivalent institution. There was no German Royal Society. The Berlin Academy, which he had actually helped found, had neither the prestige nor the machinery to mount a counter-campaign. This is not to say the dispute was purely nationalist in cause. It wasn't. Newton's paranoia and Leibniz's naivety were personal, not national. But it is to say that the institutional landscape was deeply unequal, and that the inequality fell along lines of nationality in ways that neither man fully controlled. Newton didn't need to be consciously nationalist to benefit from nationalism's structures. Leibniz didn't need to be innocent to be destroyed by them. Here is what both men had in common and what the rivalry actually reveals about both of them. They were each, in different ways, building their intellectual achievement in opposition to the other. Newton's mystique, the solitary genius, the singular discoverer, depended on Leibniz being a plagiarist, not merely being wrong or being late, being a thief. Because a late but independent co-discoverer still shares the achievement. Only a thief leaves Newton alone on the shore. Leibniz's legacy, the universal polymath, the philosopher-scientist who unified knowledge, depended on Newton being a petty, retrograde figure, too small to recognize genuine, independent thought. Because if Newton was right, even partly, then Leibniz's greatest mathematical achievement was shadowed by appropriation. Each man's preferred version of himself required the other man to be something diminished. This is what the rivalry was really about, not the calculus. The calculus was just the arena. The war was over which story would survive, whose version of reality would be written into the record. And Newton won that war, comprehensively, institutionally, with the full weight of England's scientific establishment behind him, while Leibniz was buried in Hanover with his secretary as the only mourner. But winning a version of history is not the same as being right. Most modern historians of mathematics, working from the full manuscript record with the benefit of 3 centuries of perspective, conclude that Leibniz's calculus was genuinely independent, that he developed his own framework through his own work, building on mathematical ideas he encountered during his Paris years with Huygens, and that while Newton's letters of 1676 may have influenced some specific elements, the essential architecture was Leibniz's own. They also conclude that Newton invented the calculus first, in the 1660s, during those extraordinary plague years. 2 things can be true at once. Newton was first, Leibniz was independent. The Commercium Epistolicum did not allow for this complexity. It was not designed to. Newton won the dispute by every institutional and public measure. He died in 1727, aged 84, celebrated across the world. Voltaire attended his state funeral and wrote about it with barely concealed awe. Alexander Pope wrote perhaps the most famous epitaph in the English language. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. His pallbearers included dukes and earls. And yet, the calculus dispute, which occupied the last 3 decades of his life with an intensity that disturbs anyone who examines it closely, had done something to him, or had revealed something in him that had always been there. In the years following the Commercium Epistolicum, Newton was not primarily occupied with science. His major scientific work was long behind him. The Principia had been published in 1687. The optics work was done. What he was doing, in his final decades, was managing a grudge, maintaining an institutional narrative, corresponding with allies, writing anonymous pamphlets, ensuring that the record said what he needed it to say. A man who had once spent 18 months alone on a farm solving problems that had defeated every mind in Europe, spending his last years writing anonymous reviews of his own anonymous verdict. There is something deeply sad in this. Newton never married. He appears to have had no romantic relationships of any consequence. His closest emotional attachment, to Fatio de Doulier, a younger man whose sudden departure from his life in 1693 preceded what some biographers describe as a near-complete mental breakdown, was never explained publicly by either party. He had colleagues but not friends in any warm sense. He had disciples but not equals. He was, in the end, what he had always been: alone. Magnificently alone. Strategically alone. He had never been capable of sharing credit with anyone. Not Hooke, who he destroyed in a separate dispute over optics and gravity. Not Flamsteed, the astronomer royal, whose star catalogue he appropriated and published without permission. Not Leibniz. His genius was real. His isolation was chosen. And the two were connected in ways that even he probably could not have articulated. What the calculus war cost Newton was not his reputation. He kept that and built it higher. What it cost him was the version of himself he might have been. The scientist who could have acknowledged, without diminishment, that another extraordinary mind had arrived at a similar place. The man who could have said, "We both found it." That is what the problem was ripe for. That is what this century required. He could never say it. And so the thing he was most afraid of, being seen as merely human, merely finite, merely one of two rather than one alone, became, in the very act of fighting it, the thing most visible about him. Leibniz lost the war in England, but he did not lose it in Europe, not immediately, not entirely. Continental mathematicians continued to use his notation and develop his framework throughout the 18th century. The Bernoulli brothers, Euler, D'Alembert, Lagrange. The great flowering of calculus-based physics and mathematics in the 1700s was built almost entirely on Leibniz's notation, Leibniz's differentials, Leibniz's framework. dx and dy, his notation, is how every physicist, engineer, and mathematician in the world still writes calculus today. Newton's dot notation, which he used in his own work and which his English followers defended fiercely, survives only in limited contexts. Time derivatives in classical mechanics, mostly. A specialist notation in a specialist field. The world chose Leibniz's language to describe itself. This is not a small thing. If language shapes thought, and if mathematical notation is a kind of language, which every working mathematician will tell you it is, then Leibniz's way of thinking about the calculus is the way the modern world thinks about it. His conceptual frame, his symbols, his approach, these are the lens through which differential equations, fluid dynamics, quantum mechanics, general relativity have all been developed. In this sense, Leibniz's legacy may be deeper than Newton's in mathematics, even as Newton's reputation was, for most of the following century, incomparably higher. But what the priority dispute cost Leibniz personally was devastating. It cost him his last years. The hope of London, the recognition he had wanted all his life from the one country whose scientific establishment was powerful enough to confer it. It cost him the unified philosopher's ambition, the dream of a lingua universalis, a universal logical language that would allow all human knowledge to be expressed and computed, which he had pursued alongside his mathematics for decades, and which was never taken seriously by an English audience that had decided he was a plagiarist. It cost him the History of Brunswick, which he never finished, and which earned him the contempt of his employer in his final years. And it cost him the death he deserved, not in Westminster Abbey, not with dukes as pallbearers, not with the world watching, in a rented room, at night, with a secretary who had stayed out of loyalty, or habit, or simple proximity, and with almost no one in Hanover or London or Paris who paused to mark the fact that one of the great minds of the century had gone quiet. He had wanted to be loved by everyone. He had wanted credit and connection and recognition from all quarters simultaneously. And the wanting of it, the visible, undisguised wanting, may have been the thing that made it easiest for Newton to destroy him. Because a man who wants to be universally admired is a man with a vulnerability anyone can see. Newton did not want to be admired. Newton wanted to be correct. The distinction was everything. History has spent 300 years trying to assign this rivalry cleanly. For most of the 18th century, England gave Newton the victory absolutely, and the continent gave Leibniz qualified sympathy. By the 19th century, the weight of the manuscript evidence had begun to shift scholarly opinion towards something more nuanced. By the 20th century, most historians of mathematics were willing to state what the evidence supported: two independent inventors, with Newton first in chronological terms and Leibniz first in publication and in the practical development of a working notational system. The Commercium Epistolicum is now read not as an impartial verdict, but as one of the most remarkable examples of institutional manipulation in the history of science. When it was finally revealed, in the early 19th century, that Newton had written significant portions of the report himself, the reaction in the European mathematical community was not surprise. They had suspected it, but something closer to confirmation of a long-standing dread. The greatest scientist of his age had used the greatest scientific institution of his age to falsify a historical record. And yet, we need to be careful about simplifying this in the other direction. Newton was not simply a villain. He was a man who had genuinely made a discovery first, who had genuine grounds for believing that his work had been seen before Leibniz's publication, who had been attacked in print by Leibniz's allies, including a passage in the Acta Eruditorum that implied, however obliquely, that Newton had taken from Leibniz rather than the reverse. He was not responding from nothing. He was responding from a place of real injury, however inflated and paranoid his response became. Leibniz was not simply a victim. He was a skilled political operator in his own right, who understood the value of reputation and was not above strategic self-presentation. His own anonymous publications in the dispute were not above reproach. His suggestion in the Acta Eruditorum that Newton may have derived from him, made without evidence, in print, was the kind of provocation that a man of his intelligence must have known was dangerous. They were both, in different ways, too proud to take the simple path. The simple path was this: acknowledge each other. Accept that two minds, working independently in the same century on the same problem, had both found it. Celebrate the fact that the problem was so ripe, so necessary, that history produced two answers. This path was always available. Neither man took it. What does this rivalry reveal about ambition, about ego, about the price of being first? It reveals this: the drive that produces genius is often the same drive that makes the genius incapable of sharing it. Newton's isolation, his refusal of community, his paranoid self-sufficiency was the same quality that allowed him to sit alone on a farm for 18 months and invent the mathematics of the universe. You cannot produce that kind of work while caring too much about what other people think. You cannot produce it while leaving your door open. You need the locked room, the closed drawer, the years of unseen labor. But the qualities of the locked room are also the qualities of the Commercium Epistolicum: the same self-sufficiency, the same certainty, the same refusal to allow any reality other than his own version to exist. Leibniz's gregariousness, his hunger for connection, his habit of writing letters to everyone, his belief that all knowledge could eventually be unified into a great harmonious whole, was the same quality that made his mathematics collaborative, communicative, useful to everyone who came after him. His notation spread because he wanted it to spread. He published because he wanted to be part of the conversation. But that same openness was what made him ask Newton's institution to investigate Newton. What made him believe, to the end, that reason and evidence would win in a room where the judge had already written the verdict. The rivalry made both men less than they were, and both men, in ways they could not see, made each other greater than they might have been alone. Newton's fear of Leibniz drove him to document his prior work more carefully, to engage with critics more systematically, to assert the completeness and priority of the Principia with an urgency he might not have felt without a challenger. The Principia was partly written for the ages. It was partly written against Leibniz. Leibniz's awareness of Newton, the towering, closed, already mythic figure across the channel, sharpened his own work, gave it a competitive edge, drove him to publish when he might otherwise have waited, to develop the notation into something clean and teachable rather than merely theoretical. They needed each other. They would never have admitted it. There is a question that has interested me from the very beginning of this story. Not the historical question, not the mathematical one, but something quieter. It is this. On a winter night in Hanover, in 1716, as Leibniz lay dying, his fame diminished, his patron in London, his greatest work dismissed, his secretary keeping watch in the dark, what did he think about? Did he think about the calculus? The dispute? The letters he had sent and not sent? Or did he think about the Paris years, when Huygens showed him the frontier of the unknown, and he understood for the first time what he was capable of? And in London, in 1727, as Newton lay dying in his own bed, celebrated, knighted, buried in waiting at Westminster Abbey, did he think about the letters he had written, the committees he had stacked, the anonymous pamphlets? Or did he think about Woolsthorpe, the farm, the closed room, the 18 months when he was alone with the ocean of truth, and the ocean was giving up its secrets to a boy with a quill and no audience at all? Here is what I keep returning to. The calculus, the actual mathematics, the tool that would eventually build the bridge to quantum mechanics and general relativity, and every technology that came from understanding continuous change, did not need either man to have been right in the dispute. It needed both of them to have existed. It needed Newton's locked room and Leibniz's open letters. It needed the private discovery and the published notation. It needed the man who kept everything to himself and the man who shared everything freely. Neither version alone would have been enough. So perhaps the question is not, who was right? Perhaps the question is, what happens to knowledge when the people who create it cannot bear to let it belong to anyone but themselves? And, is there a version of genius, any version, that does not exact this price? Because every century has its Newton and its Leibniz. Every era produces the man who discovers and hoards and defends, and the man who discovers and shares and suffers for the sharing. And we are, even now, living with the mathematics they both built. Even now writing dx over dy on classroom boards. Even now solving problems they made possible. Without either of them knowing it would come to this. Without either of them being able to share it.